On June 6th, 2024, my dad was down in St. Louis for my grandpa's birthday. He loves Native American artifacts, so they went down to go to the Cayuga Mounds. However, at the viewing platform there, he looked down and saw a couple of switcher locomotives owned by the Port Harbor Railroad. Knowing that I was a rail fan, Dad walked down and obviously took some photos of them, which you are seeing now. However, the engineer assigned to the switchers saw him taking pictures of them and asked him if he wanted to go up into the cab. And he was like, heck yeah! When he got up in the cab, he started rambling about how jealous I would be that he got a cab ride. And then the engineer was like, oh, well, you should bring him down here so I can let him up into the cab. Heck, I'll even drive him around the railroad if you want. And so a couple months later, on October 17th, we scheduled a day to go down to Granite City to ride on the Port Harbor Railroad. We hopped in the car pretty late in the afternoon after Dad got off of work and headed down to St. Louis. The 5-hour drive was pretty boring and incredibly exhausting, but I already been down to St. Louis once this year, so I knew what to expect. Even so, we did get to see a couple interesting things on our way there, starting off with the most ridiculous Buc-ee's sign I think that exists. I passed this a lot and only now I got a photo of it. There was also this random, luxury looking high-class bus/RV thing. I don't know why this is here, but it looks kinda cool. Now we see our first train. I'm guessing this is a BNSF one, based on the BNSF rolling stock. Here we pass over the absolutely giant quarry in Homewood. I see this thing a lot. Somehow I managed to see it on every single train trip I go on. Then we got stuck in absolutely unmanageable garbage traffic for 20 minutes. We were here for a while, before eventually the traffic cleared. Here you get to see the road construction that was causing said traffic. The sunset was looking pretty nice as we passed over the Des Plaines River. It was even more impressive when we crossed over this other river that I don't actually remember what it was. Night fell before we reached the hotel. We were expecting this as it was a 5-hour drive, it was October, and we were leaving at 4 p.m.? We knew it was going to be pretty dark by the time we arrived, however we arrived way later than expected because of that traffic. Here is a hotel, not the one we stayed at. I don't even know why I have this photo. We eventually got off the highway and started making our way through the back roads of Granite City. We went to the wrong hotel originally. We asked them, where's our reservation? And then we realized we were actually at the wrong hotel. So we went over to the correct hotel. Yeah, that hotel ended up sucking, so I guess we're staying at the Comfort Inn next time. Anyways, here we're passing by Steak and Shake. I thought they were dead. Finally, we got into our actual hotel, and then we did absolutely nothing, because it's a hotel. What do you expect me to say in this part of the video? The next day, on October 18th, we got up pretty early, aka 6:45 a.m., and then drove over to the Port Harbor Railroad's engineer's office in Granite City, right on the river. When we arrived there, we met up with the engineer, who I won't say the name of because I don't want him to get fired by Port Harbor for doing this. Anyways, when we arrived, he took us inside and gave us high-vis vests so that we wouldn't get, seen and noticed as being not railroad employees. Then I took this cool picture of one of the pictures that was inside of the engineer's office. Here you can see one of the Port Harbor's Illinois Terminal tribute units next to NS 1072, the Illinois Terminal Heritage Unit, which I've actually seen. Very neat. After that, we took a little tour around the railroad in his truck, seeing all the sights we could only from the road. First at the locomotive shops, we get a small glimpse of some of the crazy power over there before we head into some of the terminals on the Port Harbor Railroad. Here we see lots of tank cars. This is a chemical processing facility, aka the place where they put extremely dangerous substances into tank cars and think it's a good idea to transport literal explosives on trains that could very well derail at any moment. But hey, it's better than transporting them by truck, so I'm not complaining. Anyways, I forgot the name of the specific chemical company these cars are loaded at, but yeah, they're loaded here and Port Harbor switches them out with the TRRA so that they can go onto the main line. Here we see a random coach stored in the back of the railroad, and then we head over to the grain area. Or actually, I think this is soybean meal. Again, this is another industry the Port Harbor Railroad serves. Lots and lots of grain hoppers are stored here. The river is low right now, so nothing can get shipped out. There were literally no operations going on at the Port Harbor on this day, aside from the CSX transfer, which used CSX power. So instead, we decided to basically just go around and goof off on random locomotives. Anyways, first we drove over to the locomotive shops. Here there was, a very interesting mix of power. Starting off with Port Harbor 9335, which is the brand new Conrail tribute unit. It's so new that it literally hasn't even entered service yet. Since Port Harbor doesn't own the Conrail name, the loco has this very nice recreation of the Conrail logo with the PH font. I'm very glad they decided to make this thing a Conrail tribute unit, because you want to know what it looked like before they did that? This. Ew. Also here was Respondic Rail Corporation number 1800, a GP8. See, Respondic Rail Corporation is a leasing company and holding company, and they own the Port Harbor Railroad. And so when the locos aren't being leased to other railroads, they work here. This loco is a GP8, so it's actually pretty surprising that this thing is still in service, considering it was originally a GP7. Also here is Port Harbor 1602, which is a GP9U. The GP9U was a rebuild of EMD's incredibly successful GP9. Pretty much the only difference between this and an authentic unrebuilt GP9 is the chop nose, at least visually. There were some mechanical upgrades that went along with the rebuild, most noticeable by the two massively tall stacks that are definitely not present on the original GP9 design. I believe this is the only loco painted in this scheme. It's the old Port Harbor one. Next to it was 2064, which is in the Illinois Terminal paint scheme. Apparently the guy who owns Port Harbor is a big Illinois Terminal fan, so he painted a whole section of his roster into IT paint. This was the only one at the loco shops on this specific day, however. This loco has probably the most interesting history of all of the ones at the Port Harbor, because it was a Soo Line Bandit only a few years before right now. I'm so sad they repainted it, because if it wasn't, it would have been the only Soo Line Bandit still around in 2024. And the last loco at the shop was 8955, which is one of Port Harbor's two special units, this one being the First Responders Tribute Unit. It's painted in a special red livery with lots of logos on the side to reflect that. It's a very nice paint scheme. The only unit that could beat it out in this category would be CSX 911. Anyways, after I was done taking photos of all the locos from the ground, the engineer said that I could go up into them to take photos from the running boards, so here's a couple. First, I walked along the side of 8955, where we get a good view of all of the logos that are on the side. From 8955, we see 1602 again. Here we are standing on the front running board of 2064. Here we are on 1800. And here's 8955's rear from 1800's cab. After that, we departed to go over to the other locomotive that was at the Port Harbor on this day, because it just happened to be sitting over at the grain scale and wasn't in the loco shop, so we didn't have to do any switching to get it out. We passed by the large chemical plant in the middle of the Port Harbor Railroad. This is the bread and butter of this place. It's where they get 90% of all of their traffic, second only to grain. Here we pass by the car storage sidings. They're pretty filled now since the water has been low in the port for a couple days. But according to the engineer, they're going to get a lot busier in the coming months. Anyways, you want to know what the loco that was just happened to be sitting there was? Yeah, it was this. 5730, the other Port Harbor Special Unit, the Saluting Our Veterans Unit. And unlike 8955, this thing was fully operational and ready to roll, which means that I got to ride around on it. This unit is awesome, not only because it's a special unit, not only because it's in a very weird and honestly really awesome paint scheme, but also because it's a Canadian Pacific locomotive, and you can tell because of the Canadian spec work on the front. CP has removed this spec work from a lot of their older SD40s, not all of them, but a lot of them, and so it's nice to see that this one on a totally unrelated railroad somehow still has it. Anyways, here's me walking along the side of 5730. You get to see all of the special Saluting Our Veterans livery here. There's also a window where you can see the engine. I don't know why it's there, but it's there. Here's the other side, the properly lit one. And here's looking back from the cab. After that, it was time to get the unit ready, and I was allowed to fire the thing. Oh my god, this is so awesome. First, we turned it on with this little switch.
Yeah, so it smacks in the back. There you go. We got all the main breakers up, so we're good to go there.
And then headed over to the engine, because, yes, you have to turn the engine on. There was also this large area of, I think that's oil down there. They should probably clean that out. Anyways, first we primed the fuel. And then started up to the prime mover. Just listen to that 645 roar. After that, we got off to head up to the cab at the front. I noticed that there was some soybean meal laying here underneath the locomotive. Also, the trucks still say Canada on them. Here you can see a view from the rear platform of the locomotive. After that, we went into the cab, where I get to view the control stand. I've played 3,000 hours of train sim, so I know what this looks like. I am not joking. Now we view the top of the cab. As you can see, it says 5730, because this is 5730. Here are some of the gauges that control, well, nothing actually, they're just gauges. And here's the view out of the front of the cab. You can very clearly see the external handbrake. And after that, it was time to go. We decided to go off to where another locomotive that I had seen on the road coming in was parked, so I could get some photos of that one. Anyways, on our way out, we passed by this TRRA train. Port Harbor switches this TRRA train together almost every day, so it can go out to the TRRA yard, which is also here in Granite City. The next item of note along our route was this railroad crossing. There's not really anything too special about the crossing itself. It's just I've never been on a train going through a crossing. It's usually always the other way around. So it was really cool. Also to learn that the engineer can control the crossings from inside the loco. Plus, we get to hear the horn of 5730, which is a very weird sounding but nice one, as we go over it. After not too long of traveling, we arrived at what the engineer called the coal yard. Not sure why though. Anyways, here parked was the other loco I wanted to get photos of, Port Harbor 2758, which is another SD40-2, this one painted in Port Harbor's official paint scheme. Here you can see the chemical plant in the middle of the facility. Anyways, here's the loco. It says America Central Port on the side, which is like Port Harbor's slogan. You can also see 5730 in the background of this shot with its headlights on. I really do like the paint scheme they have on this, and I'm very glad they adopted it as their standard paint scheme. It looks really good. Here's me standing on the front of 2758. And here's 5730 viewed from 2758. After that, I wanted a grab shot of 5730 moving from the outside. So I told the engineer that, and then I walked up a little bit forward into where the sun could hit the loco. Then he drove it forward and back on this little section of track so that I could get a video, and then came back to park it in front of us so we could get back on and continue our journey. Now we had seen every locomotive that was on this section of the Port Harbor and could be accessed easily by rail, so we decided to go for a joyride around the North Loop instead. However, as we were going to the junction to the North Loop, we spotted a rail fan sitting at the crossing. Little did he know I was riding around in the cab on this day. Once we stopped, I realized that this locomotive still had its CP rail inspection data intact, written in both English and French. Then we got out and flipped the switch to take us onto the North Loop. I decided to go out and film from the outside again as 5730 headed over the switch and connected onto the main track. After that, we roared the loco into life once again, headed over the points, which are now facing the correct direction, and rode around the whole North Loop going long and forward, which was pretty impressive. Anyways, I think now's a good time to explain the history of 5730, which is very simple. It was built for Canadian Pacific as CP-5730, served through CP and was eventually sold off to Port Harbor and was repainted into the Veterans Scheme in 2020. That's it. Pretty simple history, but very nice loco. Now we pass by that coach we saw earlier, which is MPLX 1392. According to the engineer, this coach has been sitting here for literal decades and probably won't be going anywhere. Here we are going over what I believe are the only 2 diamonds on the whole Port Harbor, but don't quote me on that. The loco shook quite a bit as it passed over them. Here we're passing by another one of PHR's customers, a lumber mill. Fun fact, the railroaders at the Port Harbor call this crossing the Poo Crossing, since it goes into the wastewater treatment plant. Very funny. Here we once again pass by the tank cars that are currently stored at the Port Harbor Railroad. After it went fully around the north loop, we stopped, flipped the switch again, and then headed onto the siding so we could store 5730 again back in the spot where it was when we started. Now we had reached another switch, which we had to set so we could go back to the grain weighing area where 5730 had been stored and would be stored again. Here we are heading into the grain weighing area. It's really nice to see this considering that these are pretty much in every railroad and you almost never get to see them. And with that, we had finished our tour of the Port Harbor by rail. However, we still weren't done with this fun little short line, because while we were riding, we heard on the radio that there was another operation. And so the engineer was awesome and literally radioed the other guy to ask him, hey, what locos are you using? Turned out he was using CSX power, but he had a mace leading in his consist, so we decided to go over there and see it. Here are a couple grab shots of 5730 I took after we got off. Here we are leaving Port Harbor. We get one final view of all of the grain cars stored here. At the very end is an IPD hopper. We made a quick stop back at the Port Harbor offices so I could go to the bathroom, and then drove off to Port Harbor's other operation down at the south end of the TRRA yard. On our way to the other operation, we had to drive on some absolutely insane gravel roads. You are definitely not supposed to go back here. Do not try this at home. Oh wait, you can't. Do not try this at the Port Harbor Railroad in Granite City, Illinois. Anyways, we snuck by what I think is an electric substation and then headed into the TRRA yard. Or I think this is actually a smaller TRRA yard that's adjacent to the main one. Anyways, here was the CSX power. a SD-70 Mace, and a Gevo, with the St. Louis Arch clearly visible in the background. As it turns out, the Mace was actually one of the rarer boxcar logo variants, which was pretty cool. After that, we drove down the road for like a mile back to where my dad had originally met the engineer and where those switchers were. After this, the engineer left, but we did meet up later because I forgot to take my iPad out of his truck. Anyways, the locos here were Port Harbor Y1296, which is an ex-Union Pacific switcher. You can definitely tell because it retains the armor yellow paint and the Y in front of its number. There's also Port Harbor, except it's actually Respondic Rail Corporation, 1239. This was the loco that started Respondic Rail Corporation, as it was bought by Terry Respondic and used to switch out cars, and eventually that company evolved into Respondic Rail Corporation. Anyways, here's the MP15 AC that Port Harbor has, the only loco on the whole roster that has AC traction. Again, this unit is in the Union Pacific Armor Yellow. Don't know if it was painted like this by Port Harbor or not. Also in the yard was Prairie Rail Leasing number 3001, which reminds me of New York Central 3001, which I'm very excited is being restored. Anyways, this was in the same spot it was last time, except now it's more obscured by cars. Here it also gives you a good view of the St. Louis Arch. Now, if you don't have a VIP ticket around Port Harbor and still want a rail fan, here are a couple ways you can do that. First is the intersection of Chicago Street and Cedar Street, which is right next to the locomotive shops. There's also a sidewalk along the overpass, which you can walk along to get an overhead view of the shops. The entire main Port Harbor Railroad complex is open to the public, as there's other things in there that aren't just railroad equipment. Here, which the arrow is pointing to, you can see this is where the grain car weighing area is, and they store locos here sometimes. Here would be probably the best rail fanning spot. Most moves from Port Harbor come through here. And that was all of the Port Harbor stuff I did on October 18th, 2024. I hope you enjoyed this awesome documentary. Massive thanks to the engineer for letting me ride around on the Port Harbor Railroad on this day. However, we didn't go home, but you'll have to wait until part 2 to see the rest of the stuff we saw on this trip. Anyways, make sure to come back next time for another vlog just like this one.